Greetings, everyone. I'm Ted Ruger, the Dean of the Law School. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all here for an auspicious intellectual event and treat as we hear from General Michael Hayden as he discusses his new book, The Assault on Intelligence, American National Security in an Age of Lies. So I think with a title that interesting, I think the discussion promises to be very interesting. I'm really grateful to welcome General Hayden here for the second time in the last 2 years. About a year and a half ago, he spoke in the Fitz Auditorium and gave one of the most interesting and engaging lectures on some of the same themes and topics that he'll be talking about tonight, although as with all of us, as new information and developments have come out, I think it'll be interesting to hear from the General in terms of how his views are evolved. I'm also very grateful and appreciative of my faculty colleague, Professor Claire Finkelstein, who will serve as the interlocutor for the General, and who also runs really a fabulous center here at the law school, the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law. Many of you are involved with, and it's been a pleasure over the past several years to see CERL grow in its impact, in its reach on the tremendously timely and important topics that it deals with, and this event is very much in that vein. I'm also happy to welcome and turn the podium over to a new colleague who is helping take CERL to greater heights, who has joined us as Executive Director of CERL, Christopher Welsh. Chris, thank you, and it's good. Yeah, thank you.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you, and welcome to all of you, and thank you for being here. Before I go any further with my remarks, just the gentle reminder, if you have a cell phone, if you could please turn it off at this time. So my name is Christopher Welsh. I am the new Executive Director of the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law, and I'd like to welcome you to our first event of this academic year. I'd like to say a special thank you to General Hayden for being here, joining us to discuss what is a critically important issue that's currently facing our intelligence community. Those are the public servants that dedicate their careers to protecting our national security. The Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law is a nonpartisan, interdisciplinary institute dedicated to preserving and promoting ethics and the rule of law in 21st century warfare and national security. We draw from the study of law, philosophy, and ethics to answer the difficult questions that arise in times of war and contemporary transnational conflict. Our strength is that we bring together diverse constituencies: public servants, members of the armed forces, policymakers, industry leaders, veterans, and academics from a diverse array of fields to discuss and, importantly, to make progress on the pressing ethical and rule of law issues of our day in the field of national security. We hold two major roundtable conferences every year, symposiums and book talks like the one you're attending today. We conduct ethics briefings for policymakers, and we produce policy papers to reach a broader audience on these important topics. All of our programs, all of our events, and all of our publications share a common theme: how to meet the challenge of acting ethically and abiding by the rule of law in today's national security environment. So we have a variety of programs this academic year that we're very excited about, and I just want to let you know briefly about some that are upcoming this semester. Next week, in a week from today, we're hosting a conference on ethics, law, and morality surrounding interrogation and torture. On Thursday, September 20th at 4:30, we have renowned expert Professor Juan Mendez giving a lecture on advancing the use of a universal protocol for investigative interviewing to end harsh interrogation techniques. That will be immediately followed by a panel discussion between Professor Mendez and other experts in the field, such as Alberto Mora, Steven Xenakis, and moderated by Professor Finkelstein. On October 4th, we have our second book talk of the semester. The book is The Internationalists: How a Radical Plan to Outlaw War Remade the World. It's by scholars Una Hathaway and Scott Shapiro. Promises to be a fascinating book talk, and that will be held at the Perry World House, which is also here on Penn's campus. And our first roundtable conference of the year, entitled Democracy in the Crosshairs: Cyber Interference, Dark Money, and Foreign Influence, will be held on November 1st through November 3rd. On November 1st, here at the law school at 4:30, we'll have a keynote address by General H.R. McMaster. And then on November 2nd, there'll be a keynote panel on foreign influence in our midterm elections. That'll be at the National Constitution Center, and Clint Watts, Raymond Baker, and Professor Mitchell Orenstein, among others, will be on that panel. So with that, again, thank you for coming here, and we encourage you to get involved with the center, to go on our website, to learn about these critically important issues, to get onto our listserv, to follow us on social media, because the issues of ethics and the rule of law are perhaps just more important today than they've ever been. So again, thank you for being here. Thank you, General Hayden. And with that, I'd like to introduce CERL's founder and faculty director, Professor Claire Finkelstein. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. I'd just like to begin by saying how delighted I am that Chris has come on board as our new executive director, and also to welcome Eileen Kenny, who is our director of engagement, many of whom you may already have spoken with her, and all that they both did to make this event happen today. I'd also like to thank my dean, Ted Ruger, who has been very, very supportive of CERL as we grow and develop different facets of our work and expand our reach. So thank you very much to all of you. General Hayden is truly the man who, before this crowd, probably needs no introduction, but nevertheless, introduction we shall. He is, as you know, a retired four-star Air Force general who served as the director of the National Security Agency from 1999 to 2005. From 2005 to 2006, he was the first principal deputy director of national intelligence and was then named as the director of the CIA by President George W. Bush, where he served from 2006 to 2009. He currently co-chairs the Bipartisan Policy Center's Electric Grid Cybersecurity Initiative and serves as a national security analyst for CNN. His previous book, Playing to the Edge, American Intelligence in the Age of Terror, was selected as one of the 100 most notable books of 2016. As Ted said, General Hayden is no stranger to this audience. In April of 2017, he delivered the distinguished Haga Lecture here at the law school, after which I had the honor of having a conversation with him. And I'm glad to see him back again today, because it must mean that he didn't have too bad a time last time. And I'm really delighted he's come to talk to us about his new book, The Assault on Intelligence. So I wanted to begin by asking you a little bit about the title for the book. The work, Assault on Intelligence, with the Trump administration very much sort of in the crosshairs of the book. Many have recently called it not just an assault on intelligence, but a war on intelligence and on the intelligence community. To trace sort of the timeline of this war, we start in the book and in public consciousness as well with Trump's lack of interest in his intelligence briefings, his distrust of the intelligence community, and his expressed distrust and sort of disgust for members of the community. So let's say it didn't get off to a very good start. As you describe in the book, however, you, after he received his initial briefing, and even before that, you had been publicly expressing concerns about him as a candidate. How much do you think his war on the intelligence community is an attack on specific individuals, yourself included, and how much is it really an attack on the whole concept of intelligence?
Well, I mean, that's the heart of the issue, all right? And the book, by the way, the inchoate outline of the book was the outline I used in that talk. Last time I was here, and I was coming off stage, David Ignatius, who was here, grabbed me and said, you need to put that in a book.
So we had some role in I'm very proud to hear that.
Yeah. And so it's a topic that's hard to get into. It's not exactly linear. The book it tries to be chronological, but there are many things happening simultaneously, all right? And so two or three things are happening. that get to the question you. By the way, that question you just asked me was raised in a more straightforward Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania kind of way, when somebody in the back room of a bar on a Steeler weekend said to me, "Okay, Mikey, who drew first blood? You guys or the president?" All right, which is kind of the question. So 3 or 4, like I said, it's not linear, it just mixes. Number one, a lot of us were already on TV. I was on TV, Mike Morrell was on TV, John McLaughlin was on TV, and we were there actually as kind of a reflection of my first book, which was, well, honest people can disagree about some things that are going on, but they need to know what's going on and not be reaching its shadows here. And so there was a lot of effort by the group of us to just explain the intelligence community after the Snowden revelations, for example. I mean, very controversial, I get it, but I actually did something like this at Oxford, and I began the conversation as, you all think you know who did it, okay? You've walked into the third reel of a movie, and you know the butler did it. And I'm going to insist you go back and look at reels 1 and 2. That's my talk. Now, at the end, you may still say, I told you, the butler did it. And may have a view different than me, but at least you know something. It's based on data. It's based on facts. And so we're out there doing that role, which we thought was actually very useful. And then candidate Trump runs for president. And he says all this stuff. And we get asked questions. And we go, well, no, it doesn't work that way. All right, I think we're going to talk later about his claim during one of the debates about the 9/11 hijacker families leaving the country. All right, and you got to say when you get asked that, that's pure fantasy. And so we're just in that pre-existent role, we begin to build up this image of opposition to the candidate. Now my escape valve was always, and I literally did this, I would comment, well, if he governs in any way consistent with his language, then I think we have reason to be concerned. A good friend of mine in Pittsburgh, Selena Zito, who's written another book about the Trump campaign, she was the one who followed his campaign through the Rust Belt. And Selena is the one who captured a really meaningful phrase that people like me took Trump literally but not seriously, and the people who voted for him took him seriously but not literally. And therefore, whether or not he governed literally was going to be a big deal.
Okay.
Right? And so I laid it out that if he governs that way, we'd have concerns. So that built the built-in tension. The second, and more important though, was the longer this went, the more it became clear that the evidence-based, fact-based institutions who would go into him, try to create the left and right-hand boundaries of legitimate policy discussion, they were doing it to a president for whom objective reality was not the instinctive departure point for what he said or did. And that's the more important issue. Not that we disagreed, but that we just flew by one another. We have a president who is instinctive, okay, who has this almost preternatural confidence in his own a priori narrative of how the world works, right? And then you have the intelligence profession that is just the opposite of that. Now, look, we can get things wrong. We can occasionally even be corrupt. But the only safe haven we have is that we try to present as clear a picture of objective reality. And with this president, objective reality is not the routine departure point. That's the real issue.
Let me just make sure. Can everybody hear in the back, or is the sound system a little challenging? Good. Okay, great. So one of the surprises of the book, to me, was the suggestion that there was already a hint, say, in the Obama administration, that administrations didn't want to listen to the facts.
Well,
And,
I mean,
paint this picture
sure.
of the
Yeah.
Obama administration calling you back in for more and more and more briefings, hoping to hear better news each time, and questioning, is that really the case?
Yeah, it was. And so kind of chapter 1 does the hand-wringing I just did, right? And chapter 2, though, I just kind of stopped the narrative. Remember I said it doesn't go linearly. I stopped the narrative and described to the best of my ability the Obama administration's relationship with intelligence, because I did not want to create the impression that we were all pushed out of the Garden of Eden on 20 January
Right.
2017. So I talked to the Obama guys, and they were very free. The issue they had with President Obama, not that he didn't respect them, not that he did not incorporate what it was they were telling him. He gets good marks for that. It's just that the information had the devil's own time leading to a decision. It was always temporizing. It was always, well, let's decide to have another meeting. And that was the great frustration within the intelligence community. And you could see that from the outside. This was an administration that could have marred a problem for quite a long time before they acted. So the frustration there was not that he disregarded it, because he didn't. He was quite respectful. It was that it did not lead to what the intelligence folks thought were the required actions.
You've heard it once, now let's move on and do something
Or how many
about it, right?
Okay, how many times are we going to meet about this?
Right.
Because the story's not going to change. And that was the frustration with the Obama administrations with regard to the intel folks.
Now, if we go back in administration, some people might say, well, the relationship between intelligence, the intelligence community and the White House and the Bush administration was even a little too cozy.
So President Bush was an avid client of intelligence.
Right.
But, human beings are all different. And so President Bush, although he really was a voracious reader, he learned in the dialogue, or more often than not, in the argument, all right? There'd be a lot of pushing and shoving. So we had to adjust to that. President Obama was reflective. He liked to read. He absorbed in the quiet moment. Okay? President Trump is a visual learner. Right? And so you've got to change how it is you present this information. Of the three I just mentioned, the one who had the most time for intelligence was George W. Bush. It was 30 minutes a day, 6 days a week, every week, no matter what. And on Thursday, it was 60 minutes because I got to go in there and talk to him about covert action. So he was an avid consumer. The reference about maybe it was a little too close is probably about the weapons of mass destruction episode, the Iraq National Intelligence Estimate. And as I talk about in my first book, Cards Face Up for all of you, I'm in the room when we voted for that. I was the director of NSA. All right? And we believed it to be true. All right? We did not need any political pressure on us to write the estimate. Now, it was certainly embraced by the administration, all right? But we did not have to have pressure put on us in order to come to those conclusions. We were just wrong. One of my last conversations with Leon Panetta was, as we were handing off, because he was my successor, I said, Leon, one more thing. I've read some of your stuff you wrote while we were out of government and how we were pressured in order to come up with the estimate on Iraqi weapons. I said, Leon, that's just not true. It was our fault. It was a clean swing and a miss. We got it wrong. And he just kind of nodded. So I don't think we suffered from the president's interest in intelligence.
So one of the things that's really difficult is here you have an executive branch with different parts of it. And while many scholars have advanced a theory of the unitary executive, in fact, the executive is not very unitary. And one of the things that we've focused a lot on in recent days is the relative independence of some of the sub-branches, like the Justice Department and like intelligence, where we expect a certain amount of independence. What is the ideal relationship between intelligence and the White House? And is it the same or different from, say, the Justice Department?
There are similarities between the intelligence relationship and the Justice Department and FBI relationship. Now, obviously, they're over here in the law enforcement lane. We're over here in the foreign intelligence lane. Right. So there are differences. But you do want a sense of autonomy in both. You do not want them to be or be perceived to be political instruments of the executive. Now, are you a political appointee? Yes, you are. All right? You're confirmed by the Senate? Yes, you are. But you've really got to work hard to know what it is you owe the president is the objectivity of the FBI, the Department of Justice, or the intelligence community. Dan Coates, the current DNI, has I think, actually mastered this fairly well. Dan was appointed much later than Mike Pompeo. Pompeo is selected as CIA chief about 8 days after the election. Right, so he's in there, and Director, now Secretary Pompeo, he has the same kind of background. He's a politician by background, in addition to an Army officer and a West Point graduate. He's comfortable speaking in political vernacular, all right? And he established, I think, a pretty close relationship with the president, which the agency liked. Okay, you want the director to be on the island, otherwise you can't get any messages. And I think he eclipsed Director Coates, also a politician, senator, Indiana, for a while. But with Pompeo now over at State, Director Coates has become much more visible, and he is off-note routinely with regard to some of the things the administration says. For example, he will freely say, oh, North Koreans, they're never giving up their weapons, right? Which is off-note. The Iranians, oh, no, they're not cheating. Why do you ask?
Right. So there's been this disconnect,
Yeah.
but of course we know that he's been marginalized by the administration and not fully.
Yeah, he does
informed,
not have the
right?
relationship with the president that Director Pompeo had.
Right. So the briefings are supposed to go the other way,
And
from the administration
Yeah.
to the intelligence.
yeah, well,
To the director
and then this brings up an important point, and it's really hard for directors to write about former directors, or former directors to write about current directors. Sorry, and so this is the most difficult passages of the book, the new book, writing about people I know still in government. But I do allow myself to say that Director Pompeo was the most politically sounding director in CIA since probably the Reagan administration. Right? The day before the president dropped the hammer on the Iranians, okay, Mike gave a talk in Austin, which really could be read as the Bill of Particulars against the Iranian regime from the U.S. government. Everything in it was correct. It's just the fact of the director of CIA making that talk. That said, the agency was really quite grateful, appreciated the fact that Director Pompeo, as I said before, got to stay on the island, got to go in there with the president, got to influence his thinking, got to be in the room when things were being done. And so I write in the book, the overall judgment of the agency was, number one, Pompeo never cooked the analysis in presenting it to the president. And if he sounded political in a couple of his talks, if that was the cost of doing business, that was okay. Now, that's not a perfect world, but that was the compromise.
So what you're really describing is a necessary independence
Yep.
on the part of the intelligence community and collaboration on top of that independence. And that's a very hard balance to strike.
Collaboration with the
White House,
Policymaker.
between the heads, intelligence heads, and the White House, a willingness to brief one another mutually and to listen and to collaborate, but yet sufficient respect for the independence of the agencies.
right.
How often is that ideal balance struck, do you think?
Well, I mean, you got to do it every day. So I'll hit some high points where it really gets hard. Early in my time at CIA, I had to walk into Georgia. So I'm getting a briefing. Monday and Wednesdays were terrorism. Fridays were the wars. And so I would do Iraq and Afghanistan on Friday. And I became director late May. By late July, 2 young women analysts came in and for the Friday meeting and had what we call a serial flyer. It's a kind of an Atlantic length article rather than the USA Today length article,
Right.
which kind of comprises the daily brief. It was a long, in-depth piece in which these 2 young women were identifying what was happening in Iraq as a civil war. All right, this is about year 3 of the American occupation. Now, civil war is an incredibly politically freighted word. And so my response was, oh, that's a big idea. Why don't you come with me to Iraq? And we did. We went to Iraq and we talked to the president, the prime minister. I talked to my station, went to a couple bases and so on. I went on to Pakistan. They stayed, came back. And I said, where's the paper? Okay. Oh, you still want it? Yeah, I still want it. But and they gave me the paper. And I said, here's how we're going to do this. Okay. we're not going to call it a civil war. Again, it's a politically freighted word. And by the way, saying this on a college campus, you'll appreciate this. If I had 5 academics in here to ask, and I asked them their definition of civil war, I'd get 7. Okay? I mean, there are different meanings for it. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to tell the president what's going on and describe the circumstances. And I did that personally. So in addition to making sure you get it right, you've got to wrap it in a way that will affect and get into the head of the human being that's carried the Electoral College. And that's an art.
That's a big challenge.
It is. And so I didn't cook the books. And by the way, by January, the official American position was civil war was inadequate to describe how bad the situation was in Iraq. All right? But it was an evolution. And so we walked the president in this direction, which led to a change in strategy, which led to the surge, which led to a diminution of the violence and so on. So, that's a common thing. And so you literally, and this is a virtue, you have to accommodate to the personality of the president in order to get the job done.
In order to get across the
Right.
intelligence that you have. Right. So one of the things that you make no bones about in the book is your level of concern watching the campaign and listening to the things that Donald Trump says on the campaign trail, things that you characterize as either distortions or outright lies. Some of the crazier things that he said, for example, there was, of course, the back of the pizza parlor and Hillary Clinton. There were all sorts of distortions.
Celebrations up in New Jersey on 9/11.
Celebrations, right, on 9/11, that Ted Cruz's father was involved in the Kennedy assassination, Saudis were flown out of the country right before 9/11 because they knew what was coming and so on. Now, one of the questions is, so where does he make these things up off the top of his head in your view? Or is he distorting bits and pieces of information that he...
Great question. So the first book, that's a memoir. Okay, what happened? Go check the files, write it down. Second book is far more an exploration. All right, and so I benefited from this more than anybody who reads it because I got to talk to people and study things and read things that I never would touch before. And so I came across a theory, all right, and I actually read it through Tom Nichols, who's up at the Naval War College, but Tom referenced some academics who had done the study, and I'm sorry I can't remember their names, but it was about the concept of metacognition. Okay, and that's the concept of thinking about your thinking. In other words, can you get outside of yourself and look back on yourself and make an objective observation? So the example used in the book is you're an opera singer and you say, "Whoa, I can't make that note." Or you're a director of a play and say, "That scene's just not working." All right? Can you get out of it? If you lack metacognition, you can't make that critical judgment on yourself. And if you lack metacognition and you come under stress, you keep talking and you make it up as you go. I think the president lacks metacognition, which is not quite the same thing as lying. Okay? And so let's go to the 9/11 families. Right. All right, so I'm doing the Bill Maher show, pushing the first book, all right, and we're talking, and Maher brings up to me that candidate Trump says he's not going to kill just terrorists, he's going to kill terrorist families. And I go, yeah, that's not going to happen. Oh, what do you mean? He says, we won't do that. And he says, what you talking about mutiny? I said, no. We all know the laws of armed conflict. We all know international law. We all know America. If that order is ever issued, the first time it hits somebody in the operational chain of command, that person's going to turn around and say, I'm sorry, that's just not going to happen. All right, and Hollywood applause. All right, and we got all done. The next week, there is one of those endless Republican debates during the campaign, and Bret Baier is doing the questioning. And Bret actually says, Mr. Trump, General Michael Hayden, yada, 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 said they're not going to kill terrorist families. And he said, what do you say? He said, oh no, I'm a leader. I'm somebody, I know how to lead people. If I direct people to do things, they do things. I'm a leader. And then Bear comes back with, but these are non-combatants. And remember, metacognition, okay? At which point the candidate then launches into an absolutely fantastical narrative about how the 9/11 hijacker families flew out of they knew what was going on and flew out of the United States several days before the attack so they could watch their husbands attack the United States on television from the countries from whence they came. Almost none of the 9/11 hijackers were married. None of them had any family members in the United States. Nobody left the United States before the attack. It was all made up.
Okay, but let's take that example, okay, because it does give some insight to where these ideas might come from. In fact, in 2005, the New York Times reported that a couple of days after 9/11, a number of prominent Saudi families, including members of the royal family, were flown out by the FBI. And a few days after that, some were flown out from Providence, Rhode Island, some were flown out from Vegas, about 100 in all, and that in fact the FBI had not owned up to doing this. So it was a distortion, right?
Distortion.
It's an extreme distortion, let's say, but there was that fact that came out that was previously hidden. So we've got this right-wing conspiracy manufacturing industry that produces this these alt-right conspiracy theories, and he's been listening to those, and he comes up with this, right? Does the secrecy and increased secrecy of the intelligence community after 9/11, great expansion of classification, help to fuel that in the sense that, right, all these conspiracy theories get going and somehow he falls into the...
But again, so I mean, we began the conversation with 4 or 5 of us agreeing to appear regularly on TV, all right? The most transparent intelligence community on the planet is this one, all right? I mean, and so we do talk about this more than any other country. Now, I realize maybe within our political culture, there are a bunch of folks who say that's still not enough. All right, we're not France, we're America, I want to know more. All right, so and that's all legitimate conversation. But we actually turn more of our cards face up than anyone else, largely because, well, number one, we have congressional oversight. Number two, we have a free press, and so things are more.
But nevertheless,
well-known.
you might allow that the Snowden revelations of the metadata program and so on fueled a certain amount of anxiety, maybe even paranoia. Does any of these right-wing conspiracy theories come out of that? And of course, we have the claim that Trump Tower was being bugged. And
All right, well, let me hit the pause button on that one.
Yeah.
All right. So in March, the President of the United States wakes up at Mar-a-Lago, having read alt-right press, and tweets that Barack Obama wiretapped Trump Tower. All right? There is no truth to that. All right? Okay, Carter Page had a FISA warrant against him after he left the campaign. Now, if you can take that fact and get to Barack Obama wiretapped Trump Tower, all right? I mean, it is data free. It is evidence. It is evidence free. It is simply an assertion, one that he will not give up. So this is important, Claire. So later, it's summertime now, of 17. He's being interviewed by John Dickerson of CBS. They're in the Oval. All right, and Dickerson's a pretty good guy. I mean, he's good at his craft, so he's asking some good questions. And then they're just about done, and Dickerson says, you made the claim a few months ago that, and he goes on with the Trump Tower claim, all right? At which point the president stands up, and I mean, clearly when the president stands up and walks away, the interview should be done, right? But Dickerson stalks him. Dickerson doesn't let him go. Dickerson follows him. The president sits behind the Resolute desk and starts picking up papers. And Dickerson's saying, well, Mr. President, though, do you have evidence? Do you have facts that would back up why if Barack Obama wiretapped Trump Tower? And to which the president responds, a lot of people agree with me. A lot of people are saying that is the evidentiary base for many things in this administration. If I can make it trending, it is true. Or I can treat it the way other people treat truth as the basis for my action. And so it's not always the alt-right feeding a story that he then, in some weird way, lashes onto. He actually helps the alt-right create the story and tries to create the buzz that he needs to create in order to, in essence, establish an alternate reality that is more comfortable for what it is he wants to do.
So is he Machiavellian, or does he believe these things?
So I talked to a bunch of PDB briefers, all right, people who brief presidents and say, how does this work, all right? And there's a passage in the book where one of them, and the one who studied this as a science, not just been a player, but studied the game, all right? He said, Mike, we've had presidents who disagree with us. And yeah, okay, I know that one. And we argue. We argue over our view of objective reality as compared to the president's view of objective reality. Right? We've had presidents who simply lie. Right? We've given the pitch, they believe it, but then they say something else that doesn't influence their action. He says that neither of those are the case with President Trump. For President Trump, again, I've already said the punchline earlier, the objective truth is not the instinctive departure point for decision making. And then he said, do you remember the speech he gave to the Boy Scouts in West Virginia in the summer of 2017? I said, yeah, and we were just talking in the conversation, and he says to me, and he comes back, and the speech was a little over the top for 12-year-olds, I think was the general consensus. And he comes back and he's criticized, and the president simply says, Boy Scout leadership called me. They said it was the greatest speech ever given at a jamboree. Now that never happened. And the PD briefers then looked at me and says, do you think he knows that? Do you think his mind makes a distinction between the past as it happened and the past that I need? And frankly, and it's turning into Trump bashing here, and I don't mean that because the book doesn't quite do that. It talks about the dilemma of fact-based institutions. But literally yesterday and today, we have a denial of how many people died as a result of a hurricane in Puerto Rico. I mean, it is. I have an alternative universe that does not exist.
So what was your answer?
Where? What?
Did he believe it?
No, I don't
You
think
he believed
I don't think his mind makes the distinction. All right, it's not that. I'll give you another example. So Piers Morgan, So Piers Morgan does a long form interview with the president on the margins of Davos last February, and they're talking about everything, and they get to global warming. All right. At which point the president, and I'm familiar enough with this, it's obviously a summary, but it's almost a quotation. The president says to Morgan, yeah. They used to call it global warming. They can't call it global warming anymore. They've got to call it climate change because there are parts of the earth that are getting colder and there are other parts of the earth that are getting warmer, so they call it climate change. They don't call it global warming. And then, a couple of years ago, they were predicting that the polar ice caps were going to go away. And now the polar ice caps are at record levels.
Better than ever.
Better, yeah. Which they are at record levels, okay, but not the way he meant it.
Right.
Okay? I mean, back to metacognition, the data. I'll say what I need without reference. Now, the question I ask, and this comes back now to the theory of the book. Yeah. All right, the question I ask is: the president travels in an ecosystem. All right, he had scores of people around that studio. Did anyone go up to the president after the interview and say, Mr. President, a private moment, please? Okay, so, and so now we're at the core issue of the book. Not just whatever peculiarities that personality has as opposed to this one, as opposed to that one, is what then do the fact guys do? How do they make themselves more rather than less successful in getting inside the head of someone whose cylinders fire in what is apparently a very different way than others?
So I was about halfway through the book when I suddenly realized the title is a double entendre. And I checked that out with you earlier, and you said that's right. So it's an assault not just on the intelligence community or on intelligence that community provides, but as you see it, an assault on intelligence. Yeah. Why are people hungry for this kind of information or lack thereof? Why are they hungry for these theories? Why are they,
the alternative?
Why are they believing when he says this?
So,
or even if they know it's not true,
yeah.
even if they're willing to not take what he says literally.
So very well, that's back to Selena's literally, seriously, and so on, all right? Unfortunately, the longer we go, the more I think the president is governing literally from his campaign language, so that does become an issue. So I talk to folks. I mean, most people I talk to sound like you and me. I mean, and so I got my brother to fill the back end of a sports bar in Pittsburgh last August on a Steeler home game weekend, and he overachieved. He had about 40 folks in the room, all right, and I know all of them had red hats in the back seat of their car, all right, and we had a long conversation, and I've tried to do it with other groups too, so I can to answer your question, and in essence, the best I can come up with is whatever the details of the specific claim, he is addressing a larger truth that is important to me. Now, no one's ever said that to me. That's my summary of what I hear from folks who seem not to be bothered by that.
Right, and some of those values that they feel he's addressing have to do with their concern about Muslims, their concern about security, their concern, right? There was a very touching moment that I was reminded of in the passing of John McCain after his death, where he was having a town hall meeting during his campaign when he was running against Obama. And there was a woman who took the microphone and she said, I don't trust Obama, he's an Arab. And he takes the microphone back and he says, no, ma'am. He's a trustworthy person, he's not an Arab.
Good family man.
He's a good family man, and I just happen to disagree with him. Now, those kinds of politics are not interesting to people anymore. Yeah. The details, the substantive disagreement. Why now? Clearly those forces were there before and didn't get the upper hand.
So, I mean, there's so much baked in into that question. So I don't say it in the book, but when I do this without a conversation and a presentation, I describe the book as a 3-layer cake, all right? And the first layer is obviously the biggest one, and then there's a second, and then there's a third. And I identify the layers as us, broader American society, the president and the administration, and the Russians. Right? And so you've got these 3 layers, and the size of the layers matters. It's a metaphor here, okay? And so the biggest, most important layer is us, all right? Is a drift in our political culture. And I make a big argument in the book about the abandonment of the ideas of the Enlightenment that have pretty much animated Western thought since the 16th and 17th century. Right? And oh, by the way, that's really important for Americans because our foundational documents were written by Enlightenment scholars. I mean, the foundational documents of the United States are reflective of Enlightenment philosophy. So, I mean, the drift away from the Enlightenment should affect Germany too, but it really affects us because we self-organized as a society based upon Enlightenment ideals, not blood, soil, or history. Okay. It's striking that the high friction points with the Trump administration have been intelligence, law enforcement, science, scholarship, and journalism, which have in common, they are all fact-based institutions. Now, representing your group here, all right, CERL, the Intel guy's thumb has generally not been with the other fingers, okay? I mean, my life history are the other 4 institutions kind of taking pot shots at the Intel guys, largely because of how we acquire data. All right, renditions, detentions, and I looked at your agenda, right? Detentions, interrogations, and surveillance, and so on. All right, I have to tell you, I haven't gotten that question in 2.5, 3 years. All these other institutions now have muted and mooted the acquisition of data question in favor of, we're data guys, right? And we need to stick together. Now, we'll get back to this other stuff directly. All right, but right now, the data-based institutions, even though they have some conflicts with other issues, are now organizing around defense of data-based institutions. Now, what you have in the broader society, though, is a drift in what's called a post-truth world, which was the Oxford Dictionary Word of the Year in 2016, post-truth, and it's defined as decision-making based less on evidence, data, and fact, and more on emotion, preference, tribe, loyalty, and grievance. And that is broadly throughout American society. It is fueled, second layer, by social media and all those dynamics, and we can get to that later. But fundamentally, it is a basic cultural drift inside of our society, probably created by the uneven effects of globalization. And I spend an awful lot of time in the book saying, I get it. Globalization has been a wonderful blessing for me. It has been a wind at my back for 50 years. But when I go back to Pittsburgh and drive down the Ohio River Valley and see the graveyards of steel plants, all right, I know that those same things that have made my life so much better, that has been a wind in the face of most of the folks in the Ohio River Valley.
Well, let me ask you to engage in a little metacognition.
Okay.
And think a little bit about the enhanced interrogation program under the Bush administration, which you did not oversee, but which you came in right as it was ending. And
I inherited it and modified and reduced it, but did not end it.
But it ended right around the time that you came, shortly after you came.
No, it lasted several. We emptied the black sites, we emptied the camps on Labor Day weekend of 2006. I convinced the president to make a public speech about what we were doing, convinced the president to tell all the members of the appropriate oversight committees rather than just the Gang of Eight as to what we were doing. But I also recommended we not end the program or close the camps.
Right. So you've defended it, and notably recently defended, very warmly defended Gina Haspel for director of the CIA. I don't mind telling you, you probably already know that I publicly was on the other side of that, as have several members of our board. So one of the questions is whether or not there wasn't a cost to that program, which appears in the form of this post-truth world, in a sense. Were there moral costs, ways in which people became mistrustful or disenchanted, sense that we had, whether you think it's necessary or not, potentially lost our moral compass?
So interesting theory, but not consistent with my life experience. Trump supporters were all in favor of the detention and interrogation program. It's not Trump supporters who were throwing rocks at the program. And in fact, those people in the back room, okay, the people I talked to in Pittsburgh, many of whom were my relatives, were almost blindly supportive of me during all the controversies at NSA and CIA. And so there may be, okay, as a theory, some erosion of confidence in government, all right? But in terms of the people who have hugged President Trump, those are not the people who are concerned about detentions and interrogations.
Oh, not that they would be concerned necessarily, but that there's a certain, it goes back to sort of the conspiracy
I go back to the broader distrust of government, right.
And then the other aspect is, of course, the expansion of executive authority after 9/11, and that's not a matter of public perception, but it's a matter of the willingness of the occupant of the Oval Office to take steps that might have been previously unimaginable. And we see this under Obama as well, in the targeted killing program, a significant expansion.
Yeah.
How much has that impacted?
So obviously, President Trump inherited a presidential office, a presidency. It was much more powerful than Madison ever envisioned. That's just a fact, all right? And I'm more concerned, okay, and this actually leads to a very important point. It'll kind of turn your question around and over, and largely agree. I'm more concerned about the lack of the Article I guys, the Congress, fulfilling their responsibilities under the Madisonian scheme to be the instinctive pushback against the expansion of presidential power. So we've seen that over multiple administrations where the Congress simply, to be very candid, in the very controversial program, remember I told you, I just said I'm going to empty the sites, I'm not going to close them, I actually put 2 more people in them, all right? But I want Congress on board, and I want to go to Congress, and I want to tell them what we did, and I want to get congressional buy-in for what it is we're going to do going forward. Never got it. All right? Because they would not take the responsibility.
And neither would the courts, of course, who deferred repeatedly, for the most part, deferred
Boumediene,
frequently.
Hamdan,
Not
Hamdi.
every case, not every case.
Yeah. So, all right, so the natural...
At least with targeted killing.
Yes. So,
a lot of deference.
So the natural pushback, yeah, but even with targeted killing, that's a hard job for the courts. The Congress, constitutionally, is the organ of government that declares wars. And so it should have been the Congress. They could have rewritten an AUMF if they had the courage, but they did not. Authorization for the use of military force.
Something our organization has in fact called for.
Right. But you've got no congressional action to do it because you have this expansion of executive authority and the Congress, which should be the supreme branch of government. There's a reason it's Article I, has allowed this to go. But it's gotten worse under President Trump. And this is a really important aspect of this. Right? The Congress, beyond not pushing back and limiting presidential authority, in this administration, the Congress is being used by the president to beat up and threaten the organs of the executive branch under the president that will not bend to the president's will. And so what you have are one party in Congress being used to beat up the Department of Justice, the FBI, and to a much lesser extent, the intelligence community. I have never seen anything like that in my life, where you've got the Congress trying to discipline the agencies of the unitary executive. And what you've got in the agencies, depending on your politics, are the deep state, or my preferred description, career professionals governed by the rule of law.
It is a rather extraordinary realignment so that the checks and balances that you expect to see are more coming from within the executive branch for its own branch rather than from the other branches of government.
Or the courts.
Yeah,
Maybe,
right,
so,
exactly.
so that one is, it really works very well to explain this, is that not a Muslim ban, right? You're all familiar with the great episode there. I was a signatory to multiple amicus briefs to the court. 5 former directors or acting directors of CIA, a former director of national intelligence, and a former director of the National Counterterrorism Center all consistently signed the amicus brief opposing the executive order with regard to Muslims on security grounds, not on our professional background grounds, not whether or not the president has the authority to do that or whether due process. It was just, oh, this is a bad idea. All right, and so that plays very closely into what you suggested earlier, which was the language of the campaign. And you have a president now who is the second layer of the cake, who brilliantly recognized what was happening in the first layer, and appealed to the kind of reasoning that was going on in the first layer: emotion, tribe, loyalty, grievance, fear. All right. Said things that were just fundamentally untrue about refugees and the threat that they represented, and then acted on it as president, an entirely made-up narrative. There's nobody who does this for a living who would have agreed with the narrative that the administration had used. In fact, those of us who are free to do it signed the amicus brief. And by the way, you can Google all night. You will not find anybody in our old jobs who came out in support of the executive order. blocking
It's interesting.
refugees coming into the country.
So let's talk about the rule of law and the idea of resistance, which in effect you've suggested in saying that, and suggested a long time ago in saying that if there were an illegal order, for example, to kill the family members of terrorists, the military would not carry out that order. And legally, in fact, they'd be entitled to resist that order. They'd be required to resist that order and to report their objection up the chain. When you look at the reports of resistance within the White House, do you liken that to resisting illegal orders in the military, or does this more look like a kind of dysfunctional chaos? How do you think about these reports?
Dysfunctional chaos is a given, all right? We have dysfunctional. We just do, all right? I mean, so Gary Cohn pulls a memo off the desk, right? Remember, he was going to cancel the free trade agreement with Korea, and Cohn pulls the memo off the desk, which Cohn has not denied, right? That's not the big story. The big story is he got away with it. Okay? The big story, somebody didn't say, where's that damn memo? I mean, dysfunction, all right? But this creates the devil's own problem for people in government, and frankly, for a bit for people out of government too. So I was actually doing something like this 2 nights ago at my center down at George Mason, and I was on stage with Jim Clapper, Phil Mudd, whom you've seen on CNN, calm, relaxed sort of guy, and Mike Rogers, who had just left NSA. And we all expressed our angst at being in the role that we are in. Now, and I'll get to the folks in government in a minute, but this is even hard for the retirees. I mean, we are dangerously close to breaking the norms of our own profession just being on TV so much, all right, and offering commentary. I just offered the view, but you walk past those little things in the hall that says, in emergency, break glass. And I'm knowing full well that some of the things we collectively do will erode some of the values that we've spent our lives supporting inside of our own profession, not American values, but the autonomy and so on of the intelligence community. But that the situation is such, and the line I used is, we cannot let our countrymen begin to believe this is normal. This is not normal. We have to point out it is not normal, in the literal meaning of the word, observing of norms. And in doing that, we are dangerously close to violating the norms of our own profession. The tribal elders in the intelligence community, the kind of very senior retirees, are of mixed views, all right, of pushing back against the duly elected president. So that's one danger. Now you've got the folks inside government, and I actually end the book with this, saying, so I'm asked, I got a phone call from somebody whose name you might recognize about March, maybe April of 17, saying, hey, Mike, I just been told I'm on a very short list for a very big job. What do you think? And I said, well, if you'd have called me during the transition, I'd have said, do your duty. If you'd have called me 6 or 8 weeks ago, I said, let's have breakfast. But you called me today. So this is pretty straightforward. Don't do it. And his response was, oh, thank God. On the grounds that he did not want to. He greatly feared doing it, but he felt he was being overly self-centered in doing it. I said, no, you won't be effective. You'll be very frustrated. You're a young man, and this is something that won't wash off.
So if we believe the anonymous op-ed, if we believe the description of what's going on in the White House, are those who stay in the administration doing the right thing to slow walk orders, to interfere with carrying things out, or should they declare themselves, resign, oppose verbally, vocally? Yeah,
I really hesitate to make a moral, ethical judgment. Mm-hmm. All right, I'm going to give you a tactical judgment in a minute. Mm-hmm. But I told you one of the hardest parts of the book to write was talking about people I know still in government. It's John Kelly and Tom Bossert and H.R. McMaster, whom you're going to have in the program here soon. And And the question I ask in the passage, and again, I try to be deeply respectful, because, I mean, frankly, I actually end the chapter with, at what point do they have to decide they have stopped being guardrails and their continued presence in the administration merely makes them enablers or legitimizers of what is going on? And then there's one more sentence in the chapter. And what will become of us if they leave? Mm-hmm. So this is not easy. Operationally, tactically, I would never have signed the anonymous op-ed. I never would have chosen that course of action. I don't think it's operationally or constitutionally sustainable. I don't think its effect is great enough, either in terms of constitutional concerns, duly elected president of the United States, and operational concerns. All you've now done is make the president even more distrustful of his staff. Okay, and so in my private moments, I think some people ought to leave. But I recognize that's a really hard question. And as I said in the last line in the chapter, and then what becomes of us if they're gone? What if Jim Mattis is not Secretary of Defense? Okay. What if Dan Coates is not the Director of National Intelligence?
Mm-hmm. Let's pivot to one other area before I get the audience in for conversations, and that's Russia.
I'm against it, of course.
You had a front row seat to so many of the discussions and deliberations about Russia leading up to the election of this president, and have been observing more from the sidelines since then. When you were here a year and a half ago and we talked about this, I asked you, why are the Russians doing this? What was their goal in interfering with the 2016 election? Why have they been trying to impact democratic nations all across the globe, possibly Brexit, throwing money at far-right candidates? And your answer to me then was, well, first and foremost, they were messing with our heads. They were trying, you also said this is the most enormous and successful covert operation.
Covert influence operation.
Covert influence operation that the world has seen, and they've been masterful at it. And when I asked you, were they doing this in order to elect Donald Trump? At that time, you said, I don't think so. Yeah. Would you stand by that answer now?
Only in a way. All right. So there's been both an evolution in the evidence and a little evolution in my own thinking. So beginning at the beginning, why are the Russians doing this? Putin's doing this for personal and national survival. His social contract during Putin 1, before the Medvedev interval, was, I'm going to be autocratic, but don't worry, we're all going to be rich. And they actually really managed the energy wealth and the sovereign wealth fund very well. That was oil at 120. It's never going to 120 again, because we got a spigot up in the state of Pennsylvania that we turn on when it gets too high and the price goes down. Right? So now his new social contract for Putin 2 is, I'm still going to be autocratic, but you're going to be proud. And his efforts then are to restore Russian greatness, to salve Russian grievances, and he's conducting a powerful foreign and security policy to do that. But he doesn't have the horses. There are 3 states in this country, Texas, New York, and California, who have economies, individually, have economies larger than the Russian Federation. Okay?
That's amazing.
Think about that. All right. Okay. So we took the nuclear weapons away from California a couple years ago. All right. So I understand there are differences, but he's here. The rest of the world is here. He can't do this. So the game plan is this. And that's the reason he attacks European unity, the European Union. He attacks the North Atlantic Trade Organization. He does add fuel to the fire of Brexit. That's why he interferes with elections, and that's why he did what he did in the 2016 American campaign, fundamentally to corrupt our confidence in our own processes. So yes, the overall objective was to mess with our heads, to divide and distract us, so that we, even though we might inherently be a more powerful opponent, if we're divided and distracted, we begin to come down to his level. Now, there was an evolution in the tactical and the tactical objectives of the covert influence campaign. It was always to degrade our confidence in ourselves and to make us less competent in the conduct of our affairs. That was constant. Okay? To a first order, he wanted to punish Hillary Clinton. He hates her. He blames the 2011 disturbances in Russia on Clinton. Blames all the color revolutions on us too, but that's just not true. Okay? He wanted to punish Clinton because, again, it's just visceral. Second, again, messing with our heads, making us less competent, he wanted to delegitimize the inevitable President Clinton. And that's why you had all the emails out there, the DNC hack, and so on. And then as you get to kind of August-ish, September-ish, he suddenly realized, damn, this other guy could win. Well, that really messed with their heads. And the intelligence community's unanimous judgment is they moved to push the vote in the direction of Donald Trump. But again, I think the overall objective was the degrading, the dividing of American society, not that we had a Manchurian candidate over here on one party's ticket.
And indeed, Jim Clapper has gone so far as to say that Russian influence was, in his view, decisive.
Yes.
Not something that
Jim in his book
suggested.
has said the Russian effort was so substantial, so intelligently targeted, and the elections were so close in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin, and Michigan, 70,000 votes, that Jim has concluded that the Russians swung the election and flipped the Electoral College because of their effort. I do not do that. I can't prove it. In fact, it's not just unknown, it is unknowable. And so it's not a useful conversation as far as I'm concerned.
It surprised me greatly, however, to hear reports from a couple days ago that you believe that, in fact, in terms of election security in the upcoming midterms, we're in better shape than we were in the 2016 election.
So in terms of actually just counting the votes, we're okay. All right.
No, I thought when I say better shape, I meant in terms of
the manipulation,
protecting against, right? Or
So
why would that be?
Why are we? Yeah. So the answer I gave is, and everyone else on stage said, yeah, that's right. All right. And it was fundamentally, we're not stupid. I mean, we are learning organizations, and so our discovery of what the Russians did was an evolution. All right, that we learned more as this went on, and sometimes we learned about it only after it had happened. And then the political response to that was lagging even behind the intelligence assessment. So the alarms were light and late, and the political response were even tardy to the light and late alarms that were put out there. But again, we're learning organizations, and so NSA is on it, CIA is on it. But the problem is, and this. Bear with me here. I'm going to make a comparison to 9/11, and I understand all the differences, but there's something very similar between the election interference and 9/11, and it is that we were attacked from an unexpected direction against a previously unappreciated weakness. Mm-hmm. Right? And the word we would use was it hit a seam. Okay? The only way you respond to being hit in a seam is to reorganize. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, the seam continues to exist. And President Bush did that, controversially. All right?
Right.
But there is no question we reorganized in order to meet this new flavor of threat. And whatever we'll have later debates about step A, step B, step C, step N, all right? But it worked. All right, we are looking at that enemy in a different way, and the chances of a 9/11 attack against this country are almost nil. Doesn't mean we're totally out of the woods. But you only do that when the president says huddle up. If the president doesn't say huddle up, everyone does more, but they play the traditional position. And therefore, you can only respond to an unprecedented threat with unprecedented structures, resources, organizations, and directives, and those only come from the president, and this president has not done that.
That's right. So that's why I was surprised to hear you say
but we are better. We are better than we were in 2016, but we are far less than we should be, or could be.
Okay.
I'm going to give you an example. And so if Paul Nakasone, who's now running NSA, discovers something, who does he tell?
Well, that was my question.
Who's the task force? I mean, we got a task force to find 3 million ghost voters, remember? Okay. But we didn't, but that's the kind of thing I'm suggesting we could have done, kind of a 9/11 commission sort of thing that then suggested different changes, but we just chased it.
Now, we do know that that a number of states and state election officials are taking this very seriously, but not all of them.
It's uneven, and here we have both the advantages and disadvantages of American federalism. I mean, we are who we are. All right, these are state responsibilities. And yes, that means some aren't doing as much as others, but it also means we have biodiversity.
So do you have confidence in the midterm elections?
I have confidence in the count.
Okay. Let's open it up to conversation now from the audience. And I think we have someone with a microphone who's ready to go around. Where's our microphone? Okay, so Marie is going to, if you raise your hand, we'll get some folks in. So this gentleman here, we'll start with you. And if you just stand up and ask brief questions,
yeah,
so we can
identify
get
yourself.
as many of you in as possible.
Hey, good seeing you again.
Good to see you as well. I'm a student here at Penn Law now, JD MBA, so Penn Law and Wharton.
Just speak up if you can.
Yeah, was curious. We talked about defensive measures for the upcoming election. Looking on the offensive side, what have we been doing, to the extent you can comment on it? What have we been doing, and how much should we be doing in terms of fighting fire with fire and coming back, the intelligence community coming back at Russia?
You can tell you've had some previously really good instruction by that question. It used to be a student of mine. Okay. That's a great question and allows me to bring up a separate but very related aspect. And I'll try to be very, very efficient. So recall in the worldwide threat briefing, the Director of National Intelligence has all the 3-letter agency chiefs up there with them, and they're going over everything that's scary in the world. And it's before the Senate Intelligence Committee. And that was a session when everyone was asked, has the president given you specific instructions to defend against Russian interference? Right. And Dan Coates goes, nope. No. And then they go down to all the agency chiefs. No. Yep. The next week, one of the agency chiefs, Mike Rogers at NSA, is in front of the Armed Services Committees. And, a week's passed, Admiral, you got any more instructions? No, sir. Well, you actually said you could do more. What is it you would do? What would you tell the president to authorize you to do? And he said, well, we have not made the Russians pay a sufficient price for what they did. Now listen, okay, think that, okay? Parse that sentence. We have not made the Russians pay a sufficient price. That is nothing about defending the electoral system in the United States. It's nothing about stopping Russian interference inside social media with botnets and so on. That's all about making the Russians less interested in doing it, because we are going to hold at risk things he holds dear. The next week, Paul Nakasone, who's coming in to replace Mike, is in front of the Intel Committee again, gets asked that question and gives the same answer. And so what you have are the commander, I said director of NSA, but they're also commanders of Cybercom Command. And so as Cybercom commanders, what they were saying, this is really interesting and important, and I don't know where it ends up, is they were looking for legal and policy guidance, a legal structure for activity in the cyber domain above normal international espionage, you do that all the time, but below an accepted international definition of armed conflict. Okay? If that's not a familiar term to you, think of a digital equivalent of covert action. All right? And that's what the recommendation was. So we'll see. I mean, these two smart guys, the outgoing and the incoming commander. And this is a White House that would be more embracing of that kind of approach than certainly the Obama administration would be.
That's interesting. Okay, so let's, gentleman over here.
To what extent has the loss...
Yeah.
Thank you. To what extent has the loss of security clearances by selected intelligence personnel endangered our ability to pass on and to respond to risks that the continuity of retired personnel.
Sure. Expertise, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Shh. We haven't lost.
Next question, what can we do about it?
Even John hasn't been contacted by anyone in government. I mean, John was announced that we're going to pull his clearance, but it's hard. I mean, the people in government, back to career professionals governed by the rule of law, they got to fill in the blank. There's a form, and it's got to say because. and there are only 13 becauses. I mean, there's an executive order that lists the 13 reasons you can lose a clearance. None of them apply. So, just metacognition.
And over here.
Good afternoon, General. Obviously, the ability of intelligence analysts within the intelligence community to report on objective facts is based on the data that they actually collect. Are you worried, or is anyone that you've talked to worried about the administration and the current political climate creating a less cogent national collection strategy and or limiting the collection assets that the intelligence community has in the future at their disposal?
Yeah, so you're talking about national collection strategy, national intelligence priorities framework and all that. Yeah, so legitimately that should reflect the president's interests. And we have something, it's a very complex, overly bureaucratized system, but it works. It attaches intelligence priorities to everything you could possibly think of so that we then know where to budget or where to operationally put our most weight as opposed to A versus B and so on. So that should legitimately reflect the president's interest. I mean, one of the aspects of this White House is that there is not this smooth running process. And so I suspect the NIPF, the National Intelligence Priorities Framework, reflects the judgment of the intelligence community and doesn't get much tinkering as it goes to the higher political levels. With regard to the people doing the job in the agency, I say in the book, and I'm very careful to point out that life is never binary, okay? It's not, it was really good here, now it's really bad here. But I talked to someone who is an iconic figure who just left the agency, and I said, what's going on? And he said, well, and again, he repeated, it's not a binary world, not a Manichaean universe, but what he is hearing more often than he's ever heard before from the people below decks, who just have to row, who are generally younger, more newsy, and more social media news sourced. The question he hears more often than he's ever heard before is, am I still part of a good thing? And the question he hears more often from the people above decks is, does this matter? A really important thing, and I actually got this observation from a close ally. He says the intelligence enterprise takes its moral meaning from the larger purposes that it serves. All right, so we've got controversial programs, okay? Routinely, we're listening to conversations for which we're not the intended recipient. We're suborning people in other organizations to tell us things the organization would prefer to keep secret, right? That only has moral justification when it is harnessed to a broader moral objective. Mm-hmm. And let me just leave it there.
Other questions? Gentleman over here.
Good afternoon, General. My question for you is, how do you see us as a country in the era that we're in? Do you see that we can be able to recover as one post a Trump presidency? Yeah. Intelligence-wise, do we think we will go back to what our intelligence community has always been? Yeah.
So, and actually, this is another element of the last chapter of the book. So where do we go? What do we do? And so my counsel to folks still in government is, remember your oath of office. Go do your job. make this president more successful than he otherwise would be. Okay? We know how to count. We know how the Electoral College works. He's a legitimate president of the United States. Get on with it. Next paragraph. Take notes. Keep the notes. Don't violate your own moral conscience. And remember, I said we accommodate every president. All right? We have to adjust to the people you elect. But you cannot go so far in accommodating one particular president that, and his peculiarities, that it undermines the legitimacy of your institution, its purposes, in the eyes of yourself, or in the eyes of the public, or really importantly, in the eyes of the next president of the United States. And so there are limits here. And so, I mean, I think, again, Dan Coates plays this just about right. He gets asked at Aspen, do you think the president should have had a one-on-one with Putin? No. I mean, you know.
Do you, obviously, just to smoke you out a little bit more and following up on that excellent question, someday this presidency is going to end.
Yeah.
Does it matter which way it ends to you?
Yes, it does. I am firmly of the belief it has to end in 2020. And it ends in the normal electoral process of the United States.
That is that your preference as compared with, say, impeachment?
President Trump not completing his term because of extraordinary means, all right, will be viewed as a coup by about 1/3 of the American population, and will be a permanent fracture in our civil society.
Good evening, General. My name is Reed Hopkins. I'm a third-year student here. I saw you speak, I think 3 or 4 years ago at Texas A&M University, and as I recall it, a central theme of your speech at that time was that intelligence and military, the intelligence and military communities are best conceived of as creating space and providing the necessary, knowledge and resources for the political branches to solve problems. And not as problem solvers themselves. So my question is, how does it change your mindset as an intelligence professional if you have little to no confidence that in the political branches to even make good faith efforts at that?
So this is tied to some other comments here. Am I still part of a good thing? Does what I do even matter? Is it attached to a broader moral purpose? So the talk at A&M, what I said was, hey, look, and here I was talking more about the military than I was intelligence, although there's crossover. It's, look, all the armed forces can do, all the intelligence can do really, is buy policymakers time and space. All right? We really can make things go away, but we can create opportunities for policymakers to step up. There's a wonderful movie, documentary, Israeli, and subtitled, and lots of it's in English too, called The Gatekeepers, which is the 6 heads of Shin Bet laying out pretty dramatic language what it was they did for Israeli security. And to a man, they are angry at their political leadership because there's been no political process, even though they've kept the Israeli state safe for that period so these processes could take place. I was in a Showtime documentary with all the living directors of CIA. And we all volunteered. I was interviewed 8 or 9 hours, and they used that much. But they had all of us there, and they ended the show. This is about terrorism. And it really emphasized all the directors who'd served since 9/11. And they had every one of us in almost the same words. It wasn't rehearsed, and almost the same words saying, you can't kill your way out of this. You can't kill your way out of this. Tenet, Panetta, Hayden, Petraeus, McLaughlin, all saying, you can't kill your way out of this. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, we are a tool that creates opportunities. And so I'm back to the larger moral purpose. If I'm going to go do things that I'm going to use the word trouble my conscience because I don't have enough time to think of a more nuanced phrase, but things you have to think 3 or 4 times about before you say, yes, sir, Mr. President, we'll go do that for you. If I'm going to go do that, I want to know that it's going to lead to something greater that it's going to create an improvement in broader circumstances. And so I do think that has to affect the folks who are still doing this work. If the president routinely doesn't incorporate the intelligence judgment in his decision making, it might affect the director's judgment about a particularly dangerous, edgy collection activity and a particularly hard target.
We have a question over here, and then one more. Take as many as we can.
By comparison, in the Cold War, we were able to spend the Soviet Union out of existence, more or less, because it was so much cost for any particular defense for one bomber would be billions, let's say. In the cyber warfare context, do we have the ability to stop countries from cyber warfare because it's so inexpensive? I'm thinking of North Korea and Iran, not to mention Russia and China. And do we have the ability to stop that because they can attack the electrical grid, which I know is something you're working on now, and other possible? What do you see as the future of defending against cyber attacks, considering how inexpensive it could be?
Right, and so you've got this great unevenness up in the cyber domain that doesn't exist in other domains of combat. All right, and something else that's true too. In the other domains, land, sea, air. Okay, in the other domains, if you've got a good army, you've got both an offense and a defensive tool. You got a good navy, you got an offense and a defensive tool. That is not true in the cyber domain. Having offensive capability in the cyber domain doesn't do anything to protect your grid. Doesn't do anything to protect your network. And so we are really at the beginning of thinking our way through all the questions that you just raised. And so you've got this little science experiment by the outgoing and incoming commanders of Cyber Command saying, yeah, but I could, do that. But then the policy question is, and then what happens? Right? And so we're struggling. Different topic that requires a lot more time. But I am not in the camp of those who fear the catastrophic cyber attack. All right? Maybe because I actually had to do some of that. And it's hard to do. Okay? I really, look, you gotta be a big nation state to turn out the lights east of the Mississippi. And I'm fond of the line that if the Chinese, for example, were turning out all the lights east of the Mississippi, that's probably not the first thing you're going to wake the president up about. There's other stuff more broadly going on. So we've got a problem, but I don't want to be apocalyptic about it.
Let's squeeze in two more quick questions. One here.
Quick answers. I'll do my best.
Yeah.
Thank you, General, and thank you for your service.
Thank you.
Former government employee, still governed by the rule of law. So my colleague and I were at DHS up until through the election, after the election. When you were last here, if you recall, a younger girl stood up and she asked a question about whether her generation was more at risk because of their use of social media and mobile devices. And that sort of, I was still at the department at the time, but it left a question in my mind. It's not really government's role to tell us how to interpret that which we're reading, that's what we're hearing. And it seems like, the adversary's sort of gotten inside of our OODA loop, our observe, orient, decide, act, right? Maybe we used to be more comfortable outsourcing some of our sensing and sense-making. Do you think the private sector is doing a better job now stepping up and asserting itself?
Yeah, so the companies, Facebook, et cetera, actually are putting effort in, sufficient, but their conscience is being pricked and they're being threatened with legislation, so they're getting a bit more active. Steve Brill has started an effort called InfoGuard that actually grades all, not stories, but sites, which I think will, as it gains more universal usage, would be really, really plus. And I'll try to be really efficient about this. It is the nature of social media that is the problem. I was in Sweden for Nobel weekend. And get this, the director of America's Central Intelligence Agency is invited by the Nobel Committee to come to Sweden during Nobel weekend to give a speech on the meaning of truth. let that percolate, okay? And so I did, and it was fine, and it pretty much reflects the book. But I was there to learn, and there was a young woman there, Zeynep Tüfekci, Turkish by birth, North Carolinian by choice, who's an expert on social media. She says, think of Doritos when you think of social media, okay? You can't eat just one, all right? The Dorito is not a tortilla chip. It is a delivery mechanism for salt and fat, okay? which creates a desire for, bada bing, more salt and fat. And so she describes social media as, so when you log on to whatever media site you want, it knows you at least as well as you know yourself. And their business model, their algorithm is designed to keep you on the site. And so it will give you things that keep you on the site. In other words, it'll give you Doritos, right? And the longer you stay on the site, the more it bends you to other commentary more like you, even more intense than you, all right? And so that back room in Pittsburgh, I asked, where do you get your news? Facebook, okay? I mean, it bends you in that direction. So it is the opposite of the public square. It is the opposite of civil discourse. You get reinforced in your fundamental beliefs, and they are made even more extreme, all right, by the algorithm itself. One of Zuckerberg's early mentors and investors, back to me, wrote a wonderful piece. I think it was in the Atlantic, maybe. Anyway, and this is, it's one of the founding fathers who said, the problem's not monitoring, the problem's the algorithm. The problem is the fundamental business model. And until we change the fundamental business model, the social media effect will, even without being manipulated, will drive us to our tribal ghettos rather than to a conversation.
Alan.
Alan Luxembourg from the Foreign Policy Research Institute. We were honored to host you a few years ago.
Yeah.
I wanted to go back to your point about what would be the best, most prudent way to remove the president from office, and your answer was in electoral defeat rather than, say, by impeachment or 25th Amendment, even though they are constitutionally prescribed methods. Presumably, your reasoning is that that won't be acceptable to the Trump base, and we will not be able to recover as a nation. But if he were to be defeated in an election, he would doubtlessly say that the election was rigged, and his base would agree. So where would that leave us?
Yeah. But the other means are not extra constitutional, but they are extraordinary. All right, and it will be viewed as the deep state or people like me, and everybody in the room, all right, who never liked them in the first place and have been fighting them from day one as manipulating the system for that outcome. Now, there are steps between here and there. And so obviously if Mueller drops something which we all go, oh, okay, that can't stand, then you've got to go do these extraordinary but clearly constitutional steps. The other step is, and here I'm very political, but you asked, all right? You got to flip at least one chamber of the Congress, all right? There has to be a constitutional break on the executive, all right? Now, I have lived, in fact, most of my time as CIA director, I lived with the party opposite the president controlling both chambers, the president being weakened, and more than a dozen people thinking they were going to be the next president, right? And so that is not good governance, okay? But my take is we've got to flip at least one chamber. Now, obviously, the House is the easiest to do. Now, what you'll get, all right, it'll just be a tsunami of subpoenas, all right? But that will be an effective break on executive action, and so that you asked, and again, I could be talked into the extraordinary means as more information evolves, but right now my formula is 2020.
Good. General, thank you so much for this fascinating conversation. Thank you. I hope you'll come back again.
Oh, sure. Thank you.